Hello. Today is Saturday of the first week of Advent. The first candle is lit. We are continuing the story of Ishtar's Odyssey by Arnold de Trede. And we last left off, Ishtar was riding on a camel, and there you see him pictured on his camel, and his father is riding his horse right beside him. See the camel, Ishtar is sitting between the two humps. It would be an interesting ride. Today's chapter is titled The Substitute. All Ishtar could think about was the punishment to come. When Ishtar asked why he couldn't travel with his father's file of camels at the front of the caravan, Salamar answered, "It is far too dangerous. Rasad and I have calculated that you are safest where we have put you, in the middle of the pack." Ishtar hung his head. "But do not worry, my son. Once we stop each day, I shall see you for the third meal." Kazim reached them, and together he and Ishtar waited for Ishtar's file of camels to catch up. "Do you wish to walk, or do you wish to ride?" Kazim asked. "I'll walk," said Ishtar, and he trudged through the sand amidst dozens of other servants, soldiers, and officials. When the sun was straight overhead, the two bells at the front of the caravan rang again, and everyone seemed to perk up. "It's lunchtime," Kazim said, and Ishtar got excited. He had been wondering how they would eat while walking, but decided the most efficient way would be to have each servant carry one type of food and take it around to the other travelers. He was confused then when only Varta, from his own file, started preparing lunch. He watched as she lifted a pouch with a long neck off the lead camel and put it over her shoulder. She then took a wooden cup out of a bundle. She opened that pouch and poured a dirty white slop into the cup and drank it. Then she went to the camel puller and gave him some. Ishtar got a sick feeling in his stomach. He watched as one after another, each of the people around him got one cup of the awful-looking gruel. Finally, Varta came over to Ishtar. "Now you have seen how it works," she said. "It is your turn. In future days, I will feed you first." She held the cup out for him. "I will not eat that," he said. Varta looked at Kazim, who said, "Yes, he will." "Kazim," Ishtar whined, "I cannot eat that. It is called millet, Ishtar, and you must eat it. You will eat it." "You cannot give me orders," Ishtar snapped. Kazim gave him a long, stern look, and Ishtar wavered. Finally, he took the cup from Varta, sniffed at it, and scrunched up his nose. "It stinks," he said. "Then I suggest you do not smell it," Varta said gently, "but you must eat it. Without proper nourishment, you will die out here." Ishtar stared at the slimy-looking mush, stuck his tongue in to taste it, and then finally gulped the entire cup down in one turn. It was cold and slimy and left grit in his mouth. "There, now, that wasn't so bad," Kazim said as he took his own cup of millet. Ishtar was still trying to chew up the grit and get that taste out of his mouth. "Why can we not have a proper meal?" Kazim sighed. "Look around you, Ishtar. Can you not understand we are many people, and we will be traveling many months? We cannot possibly carry cakes and fruits and meats." "So we have to eat mullet for lunch every day?" Ishtar asked. "No," Kazim answered. "We eat it for lunch, for breakfast, and for most dinners." Ishtar gasped, and then began to wonder if this new king of the Jews would really be worth all this suffering. Later that afternoon there was a commotion, and people started looking and pointing off to the right of the caravan. "What is it?" Ishtar asked. "What's going on?" "Bandits," Kazim said with disgust in his voice. "They are trying to decide if it is worth it to attack us." Ishtar looked again and finally saw a group of men on horses far off toward the horizon. For the rest of the day, Ishtar kept looking over his shoulder, expecting an attack at any time. But none came, and soon such events were just part of the daily routine. Shortly after the sun set over the hills in front of the caravan, the two bells rang once again. As if they had practiced, all the files of camels began to form a large circle, and Ishtar decided that these people must have done this many times before. In an amazingly short amount of time, the camels were unloaded, tents were set up, and fires were started. Kazim led Ishtar up to his father's tent, a large and colorful structure of lightweight silk held up by tall poles. It didn't surprise Ishtar at all that the floor was covered in fine rugs, or that the tent had a large dining area and smaller rooms along the sides. He hugged his father and said, "Which sleeping chamber is mine?" Salamar frowned. "You will not be staying in my tent," he said. "Kazim has prepared one of your own back next to your file." "But why?" Ishtar cried. "I want to be with you." Salamar was slow to answer. "It is the way it must be," he said, and Ishtar felt a stab of pain in his heart. He was about to argue when Rasad appeared. He stood in the doorway with his fists on his waist and a whip in his hand. "It is time for the hearings and punishment," he said sternly, and Ishtar nearly wet himself. Salamar looked at Rasad. "Karvansalar, there is no need to punish the boy. He made an innocent mistake born of ignorance." "There are no innocent mistakes on a caravan," Rasad snapped, "and ignorance is not an excuse. The boy's foolishness cost us hours of travel. We should be on top of the plateau already, but we are too late to climb the mountain in daylight, and we cannot climb it in the dark. Our first day of travel, and already we are half a day behind. The boy will be punished." Salamar had handled many diplomatic negotiations in his day and now put his best negotiating voice forward. "Surely, Rasad, my friend, you must demonstrate your strength and resolve to the rest of the caravan. I understand that completely. But sometimes the strength of a leader is best shown in his mercy." "Mercy is for the weak," Rasad snapped again. "These camel pullers and servants respect only strength, the strength of the whip, not of words." "Your own King David wrote in a song, 'The Lord has heard my cry for mercy. The Lord accepts my prayer.'" "Yes," Rasad answered, "but I am not Jehovah, and this is not Jerusalem." "Perhaps a substitute, then. Your Torah allows for a substitute sacrifice." This remark made the Karvansalar pause. "You know us well," he said. "I once had a 7-year debate about your God with a good friend." "Very well, a substitute. But no animals, we cannot spare them." Salamar nodded slowly. "Then I must bear my own back to the whip and take the punishment for my son," he said, "for it is I who failed to properly teach and prepare the boy for caravan life." "No, father!" Ishtar yelled. Kazim stepped forward and held him tightly. Rasad looked back and forth between Salamar and Ishtar. "So be it. Follow me." Then he turned and stomped out of the tent. Rasad led them to the main campfire where all the caravan, except for some guards, were gathered. Already on the first day there had been a fight over food, and another over a perceived insult. Rasad heard both cases and made swift judgments. The loss of a meal in the first case, and in the second case, the two offenders would be bound together at the wrist for 3 days, or until they could learn to respect each other. Finally, it was Ishtar's turn. "There is no evidence to be heard in this case," Rasad said loudly enough to be heard across the crowd. "The circumstances are clear, and the judgment is made. For selfish actions that led to the stopping of the caravan and great risk for all, the punishment shall be 5 lashes of the whip. The guilty one will step forward." All eyes turned toward Ishtar, who was crying and was still held by Kazim, but the entire crowd gasped as Salamar stepped forward and removed his tunic. The great man turned his back to the caravansalar and stood firm, saying, "Let this punishment fall on me." Ishtar was hysterical now, seeing in his mind the whip cutting into the flesh of his father. Rasad squared his body behind Salamar, set his feet in the sand, and drew his arm back to strike. But then he wavered and lowered his arm. Twice more he raised the whip, ready to deliver the punishment, only to drop it again. Finally he walked up and growled in Salamar's ear, "I cannot punish a noble one for the crime of another," he said. "And I cannot allow you to inflict punishment on one whom it would destroy. If your lash demands justice, Rasad, then it must find it on my back. You will not harm my child." Rasad stepped back and cleared his throat, and then yelled, "You see how royalty faces punishment?" He looked around at the faces gathered in the firelight. "Do you see how a noble one bears the guilt of the weak, though he himself be innocent?" He scrambled for some words to say, and then finally blurted out, "Now let this be a lesson to you, and do not forget that my authority on this caravan is absolute." With that he coiled up the whip and quickly walked back into his tent. Ishtar was still in tears as he looked around at the people leaving. "What happened?" he asked his father. Salamar shrugged. "I guess Rasad decided he really could show mercy for innocent errors." Ishtar almost collapsed in relief and vowed to stay away from the caravansalar for the rest of the journey. Salamar and Ishtar, along with Bozan, Jodhpur, and some of their advisors, returned to Salamar's tent, where a fine dinner had been set. "Do not get used to this, Ishtar," his father warned. "Most nights it will be millet for dinner, but this close to home I arranged a hearty meal to be brought out for the entire caravan." After dinner, Kazim led Ishtar back to the small tent he'd set up for the boy. Ishtar started to enter, but Kazim pulled him back. "You must never enter your tent until I have checked it," he said. "All manner of evil can hide behind these flaps." Ishtar nodded, and then entered after Kazim said it was clear. "There's not even room to stand up and change clothes," Ishtar complained. "It is good, then, that you will not have often clothes to change," Kazim said. Ishtar frowned, but he said nothing. At least he had a soft bed of blankets on which to lay his exhaustion. But then he discovered it wasn't as soft as it looked. Just as he closed his eyes, there was noise at the tent flap, and Ishtar grabbed his blanket in fright. "Is Ishtar of Persia ready to sleep?" "Father!" Ishtar grinned at Salamar's head poking into his tent. "You have come to say good night." "I told you, my son, that nothing will prevent me from settling you in bed each night." Ishtar's grin turned to a frown. "I still do not understand why I cannot stay in your tent." "Oh, camel spit," Salamar said with a wave of his hand, dismissing the thought. "You would not like it at all. I snore." Salamar and Ishtar prayed to the gods for safety and good sleep, and then Salamar kissed Ishtar on the forehead and departed. As Kazim started to lash the door of the tent closed, Ishtar stopped him. "Kazim, What my father said about me not staying in his tent, it is because of thieves, correct?" Kazim hesitated and then said, "Yes, it is so. If thieves attack in the night, they will look for riches and young princes to kidnap in the large tents of your father and uncles. Your father protects you by giving you this small tent far from his own." Ishtar thought for a moment and then said simply, "Good night, Kazim." "Good night, my young master. May the gods grant you wondrous sleep, for I will be watching just outside." But as Ishtar lay his head on his pillow, his fears kept him from sleep. Fears full of thieves and mad camels and the caravansalar. His greatest fear, though, was that his fears were not big enough to fear the many things that were to come. Rasad's law demanded that someone be punished for Ishtar's mistake, and such is the way of laws. They exist to keep us safe, but that means they also exist to punish us if we do wrong. But Salamar knew his son could not survive the punishment of the law, so he stepped in to take Ishtar's place. Though he was innocent, he was ready to take the sins of his son on himself. And that's exactly why Jesus came to earth. Before Jesus, we humans lived under the laws of God, and the punishment of that law was harsh. But God our Father knew we couldn't survive that punishment, so he sent his own Son to take our sins upon himself. He took our punishment so that we wouldn't have to. Our punishment would have been death, but now we can have life instead. John says, "For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ." When Rasad saw that Salamar was ready to suffer Ishtar's punishment, he decided the law had been satisfied and extended mercy to them both. God's mercy is a good thing to celebrate at Christmas.